Section 24, Part 3, Chapter 8 of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Loyola, Donnelly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark Apfelstadt. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Part 3, Chapter 8, The Bronze Age in Europe. There exists in Europe the evidences of three different ages of human development. 1. The Stone Age, which dates back to a vast antiquity. It is subdivided into two periods, an age of rough stone implements, and a later age when these implements were ground smooth and made in improved forms. 2. The Bronze Age, when the great mass of implements were manufactured of a compound metal consisting of about 9 parts of copper and 1 part of tin. 3. An age when iron superseded bronze for weapons and cutting tools, although bronze still remained in use for ornaments. This age continued down to what we call the historical period, and embraces our present civilization. Its more ancient remains are mixed with coins of the Gauls, Greeks, and Romans. The Bronze Period has been one of the perplexing problems of European scientists. Articles of bronze are found over nearly all that continent, but in especial abundance in Ireland and Scandinavia. They indicate very considerable refinement and civilization upon the part of the people who made them, and a wide diversity of opinion has prevailed as to who that people were and where they dwelt. In the first place, it was observed that the age of bronze, a compound of copper and tin, must, in the natural order of things, have been preceded by an age when copper and tin were used separately, before the ancient metallurgists had discovered the art of combining them. And yet in Europe the remains of no such age have been found. Sir John Lubbock says, Prehistoric Times, page 59, "The absence of implements made either of copper or tin seems to me to indicate that the art of making bronze was introduced into, not invented in, Europe." The absence of articles of copper is especially marked. Nearly all the European specimens of copper implements have been found in Ireland. And yet, out of 1,283 articles of the Bronze Age in the Great Museum at Dublin, only 30 celts and 1 sword blade are said to be made of pure copper, and even as to some of these there seems to be a question. Where, on the face of the earth, are we to find a Copper Age? Is it in the barbaric depths of that Asia out of whose uncivilized tribes all civilization is said to have issued? By no means. Again, we are compelled to turn to the West. In America, from Bolivia to Lake Superior, we find everywhere the traces of a long-enduring Copper Age. Bronze existed, it is true, in Mexico, but it held the same relation to the copper as copper held to the bronze in Europe. It was the exception as against the rule. And among the Chippeways on the shores of Lake Superior, and among them alone, we find any traditions of the origin of the manufacture of copper implements. And on the shores of that lake we find pure copper, out of which the first metal tools were probably hammered before man had learned to reduce the ore or run the metal into molds. And on the shores of the same American lake we find the ancient mines from which some people, thousands of years ago, derived their supplies of copper. Implements and ornaments of the Bronze Age. Sir W. R. Wilde says, "It is remarkable that so few antique copper implements have been found in Europe, although a knowledge of that metal must have been the preliminary stage in the manufacture of bronze." He thinks that this may be accounted for by supposing that but a short time elapsed between the knowledge of smelting and casting copper ore and the introduction of tin and the subsequent manufacture and use of bronze. But here we have in America the evidence that thousands of years must have elapsed during which copper was used alone, before it was discovered that by adding 1/10 part of tin it gave a harder edge and produced a superior metal. The Bronze Age cannot be attributed to the Roman civilization. Sir John Lubbock shows Prehistoric Times, page 21, that bronze weapons have never been found associated with Roman coins or pottery, or other remains of the Roman period; that bronze articles have been found in the greatest abundance in countries like Ireland and Denmark, which were never invaded by Roman armies; and that the character of the ornamentation of the works of bronze is not Roman in character, and that the Roman bronze contained a large proportion of lead, which is never the case in that of the Bronze Age. It has been customary to assume that the Bronze Age was due to the Phoenicians, but of late the highest authorities have taken issue with this opinion. Sir John Lubbock, Ibid., page 73, gives the following reasons why the Phoenicians could not have been the authors of the Bronze Age. First, the ornamentation is different. In the Bronze Age, this always consisted of geometrical figures, and we rarely, if ever, find upon them representations of animals and plants, while on the ornamented shields, etc., described by Homer, as well as in the decoration of Solomon's temple, animals and plants were abundantly represented. The cuts on page 242 will show the character of the ornamentation of the Bronze Age. In the next place, the form of burial is different in the Bronze Age from that of the Phoenicians. In the third place, the Phoenicians, so far as we know them, were well acquainted with the use of iron. In Homer we find the warriors already armed with iron weapons, and the tools used in preparing the materials for Solomon's temple were of this metal. This view is also held by M. de Fallenberg in the Bulletin de la Société des Sciences of Bern. See Smithsonian Rep. 1865-66, page 383. He says, "Ornaments of the Bronze Age. It seems surprising that the nearest neighbors of the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Etruscans, and the Romans, should have manufactured plumbiferous bronzes, while the Phoenicians carried to the people of the north only pure bronzes without the alloy of lead. If the civilized people of the Mediterranean added lead to their bronzes, it can scarcely be doubted that the calculating Phoenicians would have done as much, and at least, with distant and half-civilized tribes, have replaced the more costly tin by the cheaper metal. On the whole, then, I consider that the first knowledge of bronze may have been conveyed to the populations of the period under review not only by the Phoenicians, but by other civilized people dwelling more to the southeast." Professor E. Desor, in his work on the lacustrine constructions of the Lake of Neuchâtel, says, "The Phoenicians certainly knew of the use of iron, and it can scarcely be conceived why they should have excluded it from their commerce on the Scandinavian coasts. The Etruscans, moreover, were acquainted with the use of iron as well as the Phoenicians, and it has already been seen that the composition of their bronzes is different, since it contained lead, which is entirely a stranger to our Bronze epoch. We must look, then, beyond the Etruscans and the Phoenicians in attempting to identify the commerce of the Bronze Age of our Palafites. It will be the province of the historian to inquire whether, exclusive of the Phoenicians and Carthaginians, there may not have been some maritime and commercial people who carried on a traffic through the ports of Liguria with the populations of the Age of Bronze of the lakes of Italy before the discovery of iron. We may remark in passing that there is nothing to prove that the Phoenicians were the first navigators. History, on the contrary, positively mentions prisoners under the name of Tokhari, who were vanquished in a naval battle fought by Ramses III in the 13th century before our era, and whose physiognomy, according to Morton, would indicate the Celtic type. Now there is room to suppose that if these Tokhari were energetic enough to measure their strength on the sea with one of the powerful kings of Egypt, they must, with stronger reason, have been in a condition to carry on a commerce along the coasts of the Mediterranean and perhaps of the Atlantic. If such a commerce really existed before the time of the Phoenicians, it would not be limited to the southern slope of the Alps. It would have extended also to the people of the Age of Bronze in Switzerland. The introduction of the Age of Bronze would thus ascend to a very high antiquity, doubtless beyond the limits of the most ancient European races. For the merchants of the Bronze Age we must look beyond even the Tokhari, who were contemporaries of the Phoenicians. The Tokhari, we have seen, are represented as taken prisoners in a sea fight with Ramses III of the 20th dynasty about the 13th century B.C. They are probably the Tokhari of Strabo. The accompanying figure represents one of these people as they appeared upon the Egyptian monuments. See Knott and Gliddon's Types of Mankind, page 108. Here we have, not an inhabitant of Atlantis, but probably a representative of one of the mixed races that sprung from its colonies. Dr. Morton thinks these people, as painted on the Egyptian monuments, to have strong Celtic features. Those familiar with the Scotch Highlanders may recognize a speaking likeness. It is at least interesting to have a portrait of one of the daring race who more than 3,000 years ago left the west of Europe in their ships to attack the mighty power of Egypt. They were troublesome to the nations of the East for many centuries, for in 700 B.C. we find them depicted on the Assyrian monuments. This figure represents one of the Tokhari at the time of Sennacherib. It will be observed that the headdress, apparently of feathers, is the same in both portraits, although separated by a period of 600 years. It is more reasonable to suppose that the authors of the Bronze Age of Europe were the people described by Plato, who were workers in metal, who were highly civilized, who preceded in time all the nations which we call ancient. It was this people who passed through an age of copper before they reached the age of bronze, and whose colonies in America represented this older form of metallurgy as it existed for many generations. Professor Desor says, "We are asked if the preparation of bronze was not an indigenous invention which had originated on the slope of the Alps. In this idea we acquiesced for a moment, but we are met by the objection that, if this were so, the natives, like the ancient tribes of America, would have commenced by manufacturing utensils of copper. Yet thus far no utensils of this metal have been found, except a few in the strand of Lake Garda. The great majority of metallic objects is of bronze, which necessitated the employment of tin, and this could not be obtained except by commerce, inasmuch as it is a stranger to the Alps. It would appear, therefore, more natural to admit that the art of combining tin with copper, in other words, that the manufacture of bronze, was of foreign importation." He then shows that, although copper ores are found in the Alps, the probability is that even the copper also was of foreign importation. Now, in view of the prodigious quantities of bronze manufactured at that epoch, this single branch of commerce must itself have necessitated the most incessant commercial communications. And as this commerce could not, as we have seen, been carried on by the Romans, Greeks, Etruscans, or Phoenicians, because their civilizations flourished during the Iron Age, to which this age of bronze was anterior, where then are we to look for a great maritime and commercial people who carried vast quantities of copper, tin, and bronze, unalloyed by the lead of the south of Europe, to Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Ireland, England, France, Spain, Switzerland, and Italy? Where can we find them save in that people of Atlantis, whose ships, docks, canals, and commerce provoked the astonishment of the ancient Egyptians, as recorded by Plato? The Toltec root for water is atol. The Peruvian word for copper is anti, from which, probably, the Andes derived their name, as there was a province of Anti on their slopes. May it not be that the name of Atlantis is derived from these originals, and signified the copper island, or the copper mountains in the sea? And from these came the thousands of tons of copper and tin that must, during the Bronze Age, have been introduced into Europe? There are no ancient works to indicate that the tin mines of Cornwall were worked for any length of time in the early days. See Prehistoric Times, page 74. Morlot has pointed out that the bronze implements of Hallstatt in Austria were of foreign origin, because they contained no lead or silver. Or, if we are to seek for the source of the vast amounts of copper brought into Europe somewhere else than in Atlantis, may it not be that these supplies were drawn in large part from the shores of Lake Superior in America? The mining operations of some ancient people were there carried on upon a gigantic scale, not only along the shores of the lake, but even far out upon its islands. At Isle Royale vast works were found, reaching to a depth of 60 feet. Great intelligence was shown in following up the richest veins, even when interrupted. The excavations were drained by underground drains. On 3 sections of land on this island the amount of mining exceeded that mined in 20 years in one of our largest mines, with a numerous force constantly employed. In one place the excavations extended in a nearly continuous line for 2 miles. No remains of the dead and no mounds are found near these mines. It would seem, therefore, that the miners came from a distance and carried their dead back with them. Henry Gilman, Smithsonian Rep. 1873, page 387, supposes that the curious so-called garden beds of Michigan were the fields from which they drew their supplies of food. He adds, "The discoveries in Isle Royale throw a new light on the character of the mound builders, giving us a totally distinct conception of them, and dignifying them with something of the prowess and spirit of adventure which we associate with the higher races. The copper, the result of their mining, to be available, must, in all probability, have been conveyed in vessels, great or small, across a treacherous and stormy sea, whose dangers are formidable to us now, being dreaded even by our largest craft, and often proving their destruction. Leaving their homes, those men dared to face the unknown, to brave the hardships and perils of the deep and of the wilderness, actuated by an ambition which we to-day would not be ashamed to acknowledge." Such vast works in so remote a land must have been inspired by the commercial necessities of some great civilization. And why not by that ancient and mighty people who covered Europe, Asia, and Africa with their manufactures of bronze, and who possessed, as Plato tells us, enormous fleets trading to all parts of the inhabited world, whose cities roared with the continual tumult of traffic, whose dominion extended to Italy and Egypt, and who held parts of the great opposite continent of America under their control? A continuous waterway led from the island of Atlantis to the Gulf of Mexico, and thence up the Mississippi River and its tributaries almost to these very mines of Lake Superior. Arthur Mitchell says, "The Past in the Present," page 132, "The discovery of bronze and the knowledge of how to make it may, as a mere intellectual effort, be regarded as rather above than below the effort which is involved in the discovery and use of iron. As regards bronze, there is first the discovery of copper and the way of getting it from its ore, then the discovery of tin and the way to get it from its ore, and then the further discovery that, by an admixture of tin with copper in proper proportions, an alloy with the qualities of a hard metal can be produced. It is surely no mistake to say that there goes quite as much thinking to this as to the getting of iron from its ore, and the conversion of that iron into steel. There is a considerable leap from stone to bronze, but the leap from bronze to iron is comparatively small. It seems highly improbable, if not altogether absurd, that the human mind, at some particular stage of its development, should here, there, and everywhere, independently, and as the result of reaching that stage, discover that an alloy of copper and tin yields a hard metal useful in the manufacture of tools and weapons. There is nothing analogous to such an occurrence in the known history of human progress. It is infinitely more probable that bronze was discovered in one or more centers by one or more men, and that its first use was solely in such center or centers, that the invention should then be perfected and its various applications found out, and that it should thereafter spread more or less broadly over the face of the earth, is a thing easily understood. We will find the knowledge of bronze wherever the colonies of Atlantis extend, and nowhere else, and Plato tells us that the people of Atlantis possessed and used that metal. The indications are that the Bronze Age represented the coming in of a new people, a civilized people. With that era, it is believed, appears in Europe for the first time the domesticated animals, the horse, the ox, the sheep, the goat, and the hog. Morlot, Smithsonian Rep. 1860, page 311. It was a small race with very small hands. This is shown in the size of the sword hilts. They are not large enough to be used by the present races of Europe. They were a race with long skulls, as contradistinguished from the round heads of the Stone Period. The drawings on the following page represent the types of the two races. Skulls of the Age of Stone, Denmark. This people must have sent out colonies to the shores of France, Spain, Italy, Ireland, Denmark, and Norway, who bore with them the arts and implements of civilized life. They raised crops of grain, as is proved by the bronze sickles found in different parts of Europe. It is not even certain that their explorations did not reach to Iceland. Says Humboldt, "When the Northmen first landed in Iceland, A.D. 875, although the country was uninhabited, they found there Irish books, mass bells, and other objects which had been left behind by earlier visitors, called the papar. These papai, fathers, were the clerici of Dicuil. If, then, as we may suppose from the testimony here referred to, these objects belonged to Irish monks, papar, who had come from the Faroe Islands, why should they have been termed in the native sagas Westmen, Vestmen, who had come over the sea from the westward? Kommer til Vesten haf? Humboldt's Cosmos, Volume 2, page 238. If they came from the west, they could not have come from Ireland, and as the Scandinavians may easily have mistaken Atlantean books and bells for Irish books and mass bells. They do not say that there were any evidences that these relics belonged to a people who had recently visited the island, and as they found the island uninhabited, it would be impossible for them to tell how many years or centuries had elapsed since the books and bells were left there. The fact that the implements of the Bronze Age came from some common center and did not originate independently in different countries is proved by the striking similarity which exists between the bronze implements of the region as widely separated as Switzerland, Ireland, Denmark, and Africa. It is not to be supposed that any overland communication existed in that early age between these countries, and the coincidence of design which we find to exist can only be accounted for by the fact that the articles of bronze were obtained from some sea-going people who carried on a commerce at the same time with all those regions. Celts. Compare, for instance, these two decorated bronze celts, the first from Ireland, the second from Denmark, and then compare both these with a stone celt found in a mound in Tennessee, given below. Here we have the same form precisely. Leaf-shaped bronze swords. Compare the bronze swords in the four preceding illustrations from Ireland, Sweden, Switzerland, and Denmark, and then observe the same very peculiar shape, the leaf shape, as it is called, in the stone sword from Big Harpeth River, Tennessee. We shall find, as we proceed, that the Phoenicians were unquestionably identified with Atlantis, and that it was probably from Atlantis they derived their god Baal, or Bel, or El, whose name crops out in the Bel of the Babylonians, the Elohim and the Beelzebub of the Jews, and the Allah of the Arabs. And we find that this great deity, whose worship extended so widely among the Mediterranean races, was known and adored also upon the northern and western coasts of Europe. Professor Nilsson finds traces of Baal worship in Scandinavia. He tells us that the festival of Baal, or Balder, was celebrated on Midsummer's Night in Scania and far up into Norway, almost to the Lofoten Islands, until within the last 50 years. The feast of Baal, or Beltane, was celebrated in Ireland to a late period. I argue from these facts not that the worship of Baal came to Ireland and Norway from Assyria or Arabia, but that the same great parent race which carried the knowledge of Baal to the Mediterranean brought it also to the western coasts of Europe. And with the adoration of Baal they imported also the implements of bronze now found in such abundance in those regions. The same similarity of form exists in the bronze knives from Denmark and Switzerland, as represented in the illustrations on page 254. In the central figure we have a representation of an Egyptian-looking man holding a cup before him. We shall see, as we proceed, that the magnetic needle, or mariner's compass, dates back to the days of Hercules, and that it consisted of a bar of magnetized iron floating upon a piece of wood in a cup. It is possible that in this ancient relic of the Bronze Age we have a representation of the magnetic cup. The magnetic needle must certainly have been an object of great interest to a people who, through its agency, were able to carry on commerce on all the shores of Europe from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. The second knife represented above has upon its handle a wheel, or cross surrounded by a ring, which, we shall see hereafter, was preeminently the symbol of Atlantis. If we are satisfied that these implements of bronze were the work of the artisans of Atlantis, or the Antediluvians, they must acquire additional and extraordinary interest in our eyes, and we turn to them to learn something of the habits and customs of that great, original, broad-eyed, sunken race. We find among the relics of the Bronze Age an urn, which probably gives us some idea of the houses of the Atlanteans. It is evidently made to represent a house, and shows us even the rude fashion in which they fastened their doors. The Mandan Indian built round houses very much of this appearance. The museum at Munich contains a very interesting piece of pottery, which is supposed to represent one of the lake villages or hamlets of the era when the people of Switzerland dwelt in houses erected on piles driven into the bottom of the lakes of that country. The accompanying illustration represents it. The double spiral ornament upon it shows that it belongs to the Bronze Age. Among the curious relics of the Bronze Age are a number of razor-like knives, from which we may conclude that the habit of shaving the whole or some part of the face or head dates back to a great antiquity. The illustration below represents them. These knives were found in Denmark. The figures upon them represent ships, and it is not impossible that their curious appendages may have been a primitive kind of sails. Bronze razor knives. An examination of the second of these bronze knives reveals a singular feature. Upon the handle of the razor there are 10 series of lines. The stars in the sky are 10 in number, and there are probably 10 rings at the left-hand side of the figure, 2 being obliterated. There were, we are told, 10 sub-kingdoms in Atlantis, and precisely as the 13 stripes on the American flag symbolize the 13 original states of the Union, so the recurrence of the figure 10 in the emblems upon this bronze implement may have reference to the 10 subdivisions of Atlantis. The large object in the middle of this ship may be intended to represent a palm tree, the symbol, as we shall see in America, of Aztlan or Atlantis. We have but to compare the pictures of the ships upon these ancient razor knives with the accompanying representations of a Roman galley and a ship of William the Conqueror's time to see that there can be no question that they represented the galleys of that remote age. They are doubtless faithful portraits of the great vessels which Plato described as filling the harbors of Atlantis. Ship of William the Conqueror. We give, on page 258, a representation of a bronze dagger found in Ireland, a strongly made weapon. The cut below it represents the only implement of the Bronze Age yet found containing an inscription. It has been impossible to decipher it, or even to tell to what group of languages its alphabet belongs. It is proper to note, in connection with the discussion of the Bronze Age, that our word bronze is derived from the Basque or Iberian broncea, from which the Spanish derive bronce and the Italians bronzo. The copper mines of the Basques were extensively worked at a very early age of the world, either by the people of Atlantis or by the Basques themselves, a colony from Atlantis. The probabilities are that the name for bronze, as well as the metal itself, dates back to Plato's island. I give some illustrations on pages 239 and 242 of ornaments and implements of the Bronze Age, which may serve to throw light upon the habits of the ancient people. It will be seen that they had reached a considerable degree of civilization, that they raised crops of grain and cut them with sickles, that their women ornamented themselves with bracelets, armlets, earrings, finger rings, hairpins, and amulets, that their mechanics used hammers, adzes, and chisels, and that they possessed very fair specimens of pottery. Sir John Lubbock argues (Prehistoric Times, pages 14, 16, etc.), a new civilization is indicated not only by the mere presence of bronze, but by the beauty and variety of the articles made from it. We find not only, as before, during the Stone Age, axes, arrows, and knives, but, in addition, swords, lances, sickles, fish hooks, earrings, bracelets, pins, rings, and a variety of other articles. If the bronze implements of Europe had been derived from the Phoenicians, Greeks, Etruscans, or Romans, the nearer we approach the site of those nations, the greater should be the number of bronze weapons we would find, but the reverse is the case. Sir John Lubbock, Prehistoric Times, page 20, shows that more than 350 bronze swords have been found in Denmark, and that the Dublin Museum contains 1,283 bronze weapons found in Ireland. While, he says, I have only been able to hear of 6 bronze swords in all Italy. This state of things is inexplicable unless we suppose that Ireland and Denmark received their bronze implements directly from some maritime nation whose site was practically as near their shores as it was to the shores of the Mediterranean. We have but to look at our map on page 43 to see that Atlantis was considerably nearer to Ireland than it was to Italy. The striking resemblance between the bronze implements found in the different portions of Europe is another proof that they were derived from one and the same source, from some great mercantile people who carried on their commerce at the same time with Denmark, Norway, Ireland, Spain, Greece, Italy, Egypt, Switzerland, and Hungary. Mr. Wright, Essays on Archaeology, page 120, says, "Whenever we find the bronze swords or celts, whether in Ireland, in the far west, in Scotland, in distant Scandinavia, in Germany, or still farther east, in the Slavonic countries, they are the same, not similar in character, but identical," says Sir John Lubbock, Prehistoric Times, page 59. Not only are the several varieties of celts found throughout Europe alike, but some of the swords, knives, daggers, etc., are so similar that they seem as if they must have been cast by the same maker. What race was there, other than the people of Atlantis, that existed before the Iron Age, before the Greek, Roman, Etruscan, and Phoenician, that was civilized, that worked in metals, that carried on a commerce with all parts of Europe? Does history or tradition make mention of any such? We find a great resemblance between the pottery of the Bronze Age in Europe and the pottery of the ancient inhabitants of America. The 2 figures on page 260 represent vases from one of the mounds of the Mississippi Valley. Compare them with the following from the lake dwellings of Switzerland. Vases from Switzerland. It will be seen that these vases could scarcely stand upright unsupported, and we find that the ancient inhabitants of Switzerland had circles or rings of baked earth in which they placed them when in use, as in the annexed figure. The mound builders used the same contrivance. The illustrations of discoidal stones on page 263 are from the North Americans of Antiquity, page 77. The objects represented there were taken from an ancient mound in Illinois. It would be indeed surprising if 2 distinct peoples, living in 2 different continents, thousands of miles apart, should, without any intercourse with each other, not only form their vases in the same inconvenient form, but should hit upon the same expedient as a remedy. We observe in the American spearhead and the Swiss hatchets, on the opposite page, the same overlapping of the metal around the staff, or handle, a very peculiar mode of uniting them together, which is now passed out of use. A favorite design of the men in the Bronze Age in Europe is the spiral or double spiral form. It appears on the face of the urn in the shape of a lake dwelling, which was given on page 255. It also appears in the rock sculptures of Argyllshire, Scotland, here shown below. We find the same figure in an ancient fragment of pottery from the Little Colorado, as given in the United States Pacific Railway Survey Report, Volume 3, page 49, article Pottery. It was part of a large vessel. The annexed illustration represents this. Discoidal stones, Illinois. Copper spearhead, Lake Superior. Bronze hatchets, Switzerland. The same design is also found in ancient rock etchings of the Zunis of New Mexico, of which the cut on page 265 is an illustration. We also find this figure repeated upon vases from a Mississippi Valley mound which were given elsewhere. It is found upon many of the monuments of Central America. In the treasure house of Atreus at Mycenae, Greece, a fragment of a pillar was found, which is literally covered with this double spiral design. See Rosengarten's Architectural Styles, page 59. This treasure house of Atreus is one of the oldest buildings in Greece. We find the double spiral figure upon a shell ornament found on the breast of a skeleton in a carefully constructed stone coffin in a mound near Nashville, Tennessee. Lenormant remarks, Ancient Civilization, Volume 2, page 158, that the bronze implements found in Egypt near Memphis had been buried for 6,000 years, and that at that time, as the Egyptians had a horror of the sea, some commercial nation must have brought the tin, of which the bronze was in part composed, from India, the Caucasus, or Spain, the nearest points to Egypt in which tin is found. Here has shown that the civilized plants of the lake dwellings were not of Asiatic, but of African, and to a great extent of Egyptian origin. Their stone axes are made largely of jade or nephrite, a mineral which, strange to say, geologists have not found in place on the continent of Europe. Foster's Prehistoric Races, page 44. Compare this picture of a copper axe from a mound near LaPorte, Indiana, with this representation of a copper axe of the Bronze Age found near Waterford, Ireland. Professor Foster pronounces them almost identical. Compare this specimen of pottery from the lake dwellings of Switzerland with the following specimen from San Jose, Mexico. Professor Foster calls attention to the striking resemblance in the design of these two widely separated works of art, one belonging to the Bronze Age of Europe, the other to the Copper Age of America. Illustration: fragment of pottery, Lake Neuchâtel, Switzerland. Fragment of pottery, San Jose, Mexico. These, then, in conclusion, are our reasons for believing that the Bronze Age of Europe has relation to Atlantis. 1. The admitted fact that it is anterior in time to the Iron Age relegates it to a great antiquity. 2. The fact that it is anterior in time to the Iron Age is conclusive that it is not due to any of the known European or Asiatic nations, all of which belong to the Iron Age. 3. The fact that there was in Europe, Asia, or Africa no copper or tin age prior to the Bronze Age is conclusive testimony that the manufacture of bronze was an importation into these continents from some foreign country. 4. The fact that in America alone of all the world is found the Copper Age, which must necessarily have preceded the Bronze Age, teaches us to look to the westward of Europe and beyond the sea for that foreign country. 5. We find many similarities in forms of implements between the Bronze Age of Europe and the Copper Age of America. 6. If Plato told the truth, the Atlanteans were a great commercial nation, trading to America and Europe, and at the same time they possessed bronze, and were great workers in the other metals. 7. We shall see hereafter that the mythological traditions of Greece referred to a Bronze Age which preceded an Iron Age, and placed this in the lands of the gods, which was an island in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and this land was, as we shall see, clearly Atlantis. 8. As we find but a small development of the Bronze Age in America, it is reasonable to suppose that there must have been some intermediate station between America and Europe, where, during a long period of time, the Bronze Age was developed out of the Copper Age, and immense quantities of bronze implements were manufactured and carried to Europe. End of Part 3, Chapter 8. Recording by Mark Apfelstadt, Parlin, New Jersey.
Part 3, Chapter 9 of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Chapter 9. Artificial Deformation of the Skull. An examination of the American monuments shows, see figure on page 269, that the people represented were in the habit of flattening the skull by artificial means. The Greek and Roman writers had mentioned this practice, but it was long totally forgotten by the civilized world until it was discovered, as an unheard-of wonder, to be the usage among the Carib Islanders and several Indian tribes in North America. It was afterward found that the ancient Peruvians and Mexicans practiced this art. Several flattened Peruvian skulls are depicted in Morton's Crania Americana. It is still in use among the Flathead Indians of the northwestern parts of the United States. In 1849 a remarkable memoir appeared from the pen of Mr. Rathke, showing that similar skulls had been found near Kerch, in the Crimea, and calling attention to the book of Hippocrates, De Aeris Aquis et Locu, Liber 4, and a passage of Strabo which speaks of the practice among the Scythians. In 1854 Dr. Fitzinger published a learned memoir on the skulls of the Avars, a branch of the Uralian race of Turks. He shows that the practice of flattening the head had existed from an early date throughout the East, and described an ancient skull, greatly distorted by artificial means, which had lately been found in Lower Austria. Skulls similarly flattened have been found in Switzerland and Savoy. The Huns under Attila had the same practice of flattening the heads. Professor Anders Retzius proved, see Smithsonian Report, 1859, that the custom still exists in the south of France and in parts of Turkey. Not long since a French physician surprised the world by the fact that nurses in Normandy were still giving the children's heads a sugar loaf shape by bandages and a tight cap, while in Brittany they preferred to press it round. No doubt they are doing so to this day. Tyler's Anthropology, page 241. Professor Wilson remarks, "Trifling as it may appear, it is not without interest to have the fact brought under our notice, by the disclosures of ancient barrows insist, that the same practice of nursing the child and carrying it about, bound to a flat cradle board, prevailed in Britain and the north of Europe long before the first notices of written history reveal the presence of man beyond the Baltic or the English Channel, and that in all probability the same custom prevailed continuously from the shores of the German Ocean to Bering Strait." Smithsonian Report, 1862, page 286. Dr. L. A. Gause testifies to the prevalence of the same custom among the Caledonians and Scandinavians in the earliest times, and Dr. Thurman has treated of the same peculiarity among the Anglo-Saxons. Crania Britannica, chapter 4, page 38. Here, then, is an extraordinary and unnatural practice which has existed from the highest antiquity, over vast regions of country, on both sides of the Atlantic, and which is perpetuated unto this day in races as widely separated as the Turks, the French, and the Flathead Indians. Is it possible to explain this except by supposing that it originated from some common center? The annexed out represents an ancient Swiss skull, from a cemetery near Lausanne, from a drawing of Frédéric Troyon. Compare this with the illustration given on page 271, which represents a Peruvian flathead, copied from Morton's Ethnography and Archaeology of the American Aborigines, 1846. This skull is shockingly distorted. The dotted lines indicate the course of the bandages by which the skull was deformed. The following heads are from Del Rio's account of Palenque, copied into Nutt and Gliddon's Types of Mankind, page 440. They show that the receding forehead was a natural characteristic of the ancient people of Central America. The same form of head has been found even in fossil skulls. We may therefore conclude that the skull flattening, which we find to have been practiced in both the Old and New Worlds, was an attempt of other races to imitate the form of skull of a people whose likenesses are found on the monuments of Egypt and of America. It has been shown that this peculiar form of the head was present even in the fetus of the Peruvian mummies. Hippocrates tells us that the practice among the Scythians was for the purpose of giving a certain aristocratic distinction. Amédée de Thierry, in his History of Attila, says the Huns used it for the same reason, and the same purpose influences the Indians of Oregon. Dr. Lund, a Swedish naturalist, found in the bone caves of Minas Gerais, Brazil, ancient human bones associated with the remains of extinct quadrupeds. These skulls, says Lund, show not only the peculiarity of the American race, but in excessive degree even to the entire disappearance of the forehead. Sir Robert Schomburgk found on some of the affluents of the Orinoco a tribe known as Frog Indians, whose heads were flattened by nature, as shown in newly born children. In the accompanying plate we show the difference in the conformation of the forehead in various races. The upper dotted line, A, represents the shape of the European forehead; the next line, B, that of the Australian; the next, C, that of the mound builder of the United States; the next, D, that of the Guanche of the Canary Islands; and the next, E, that of a skull from the Inca cemetery of Peru. We have but to compare these lines with the skulls of the Egyptians, Kurds, and the heroic type of heads in the statues of the gods of Greece, to see that there was formerly an ancient race marked by a receding forehead, and that the practice of flattening the skull was probably an attempt to approximate the shape of the head to this standard of an early civilized and dominant people. Not only do we find the same receding forehead in the skulls of the ancient races of Europe and America, and the same attempt to imitate this natural and peculiar conformation by artificial flattening of the head, but it has been found, see Henry Gilman's Ancient Men in Michigan, Smithsonian Report, 1875, page 242, that the mound builders and Peruvians of America, and the Neolithic people of France and the Canary Islands, had alike an extraordinary custom of boring a circular hole in the top of the skulls of their dead, so that the soul might readily pass in and out. More than this, it has been found that in all these ancient populations the skeletons exhibit a remarkable degree of platicnemism, or flattening of the tibia or leg bones. Ibid, 1873, page 367. In this respect the mound builders of Michigan were identical with the men of Cro-Magnon and the ancient inhabitants of Wales. The annexed ancient Egyptian heads, copied from the monuments, indicate either that the people of the Nile deformed their heads by pressure upon the front of the skull, or that there was some race characteristic which gave this appearance to their heads. These heads are all the heads of priests, and therefore represented the aristocratic class. The first illustration below is taken from a stucco relief found in a temple at Palenque, Central America. The second is from an Egyptian monument of the time of Ramesses IV. The outline drawing on the following page shows the form of the skull of the royal Inca line. The receding forehead here seems to be natural, and not the result of artificial compression. Both illustrations at the bottom of the preceding page show the same receding form of the forehead, due to either artificial deformation of the skull or to a common race characteristic. We must add the fact that the extraordinary practice of deforming the skull was found all over Europe and America, to the catalogue of other proofs that the people of both continents were originally united in blood and race. With the couvade, the practice of circumcision, unity of religious beliefs and customs, folklore, and alphabetical signs, language and flood legends, we array together a mass of unanswerable proofs of prehistoric identity of race. End of chapter 9.
Part 4, Chapter 1 of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amy Graymore. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Part 4, The Mythologies of the Old World, A Recollection of Atlantis. Chapter 1, Traditions of Atlantis. We find allusions to the Atlanteans in the most ancient traditions of many different races. The great antediluvian king of the Mussulman was Shed-Ad-Ben-Ad, or Shed-Ad, the son of Ad, or Atlantis. Among the Arabians, the first inhabitants of that country are known as the Adites, from their progenitor, who is called Ad, the grandson of Ham. These Adites were probably the people of Atlantis, or Atlantis. They are personified by a monarch to whom everything is ascribed, and to whom is assigned several centuries of life. Ancient History of the East, Lenormant and Chevalier, Vol. II, p. 295. Ad came from the northeast. He married 1,000 wives. had 4,000 sons, and lived 1,200 years. His descendants multiplied considerably. After his death his sons Shadid and Shaddad reigned in succession over the Adites. In the time of the latter the people of Ad were 1,000 tribes, each composed of several thousands of men. Great conquests are attributed to Shaddad. He subdued, it is said, all Arabia and Irak. The migration of the Canaanites, their establishment in Syria, and the Shepherd invasion of Egypt are, by many Arab writers, attributed to an expedition of Shaddad. Ibid, p. 296. Shaddad built a palace ornamented with superb columns, and surrounded by a magnificent garden. It was called Irem. It was a paradise that Shaddad had built in imitation of the celestial paradise, of whose delights he had heard. Ancient History of the East, p. 296. In other words, an ancient, sun worshipping, powerful, and conquering race overran Arabia at the very dawn of history. They were the sons of Atlantis. Their king tried to create a palace and garden of Eden like that of Atlantis. The Adites are remembered by the Arabians as a great and civilized race. They are depicted as men of gigantic stature. Their strength was equal to their size, and they easily moved enormous blocks of stone. Ibid. They were architects and builders. They raised many monuments of their power, and hence among the Arabs arose the custom of calling great ruins buildings of the Adites. To this day the Arabs say as old as Ad. In the Koran allusion is made to the edifices they built on high places for vain uses, expressions proving that their idolatry was considered to have been tainted with Sabaeism, or star worship. Ibid. In these legends, says Lenormant, we find traces of a wealthy nation, constructors of great buildings, with an advanced civilization analogous to that of Chaldea, professing a religion similar to the Babylonian; a nation, in short, with whom material progress was allied to great moral depravity and obscene rites. These facts must be true and strictly historical, for they are everywhere met with among the Cushites, as among the Canaanites, their brothers by origin. Nor is there wanting a great catastrophe which destroys the whole Adite nation, except a very few, who escape because they had renounced idolatry. A black cloud assails their country, from which proceeds a terrible hurricane, the waterspout, which sweeps away everything. The first Adites were followed by a second Adite race, probably the colonists who had escaped the deluge. The centre of its power was the country of Sheba proper. This empire endured for 1,000 years. The Adites are represented upon the Egyptian monuments as very much like the Egyptians themselves. In other words, they were a red or sunburnt race. Their great temples were pyramidal, surmounted by buildings. Ancient History of the East, p. 321. The Sabians, says Agarthacides, De Mare Erythro, p. 102, have in their houses an incredible number of vases and utensils of all sorts, of gold and silver, beds and tripods of silver, and all the furniture of astonishing richness. Their buildings have porticos with columns sheathed with gold, or surmounted by capitals of silver. On the friezes, ornaments, and the framework of the doors, they place plates of gold incrusted with precious stones. All this reminds one of the descriptions given by the Spaniards of the temples of the sun in Peru. The Adites worshipped the gods of the Phoenicians under names but slightly changed. Their religion was especially solar. It was originally a religion without images, without idolatry, and without a priesthood. Ibid, p. 325. They worshipped the sun from the tops of pyramids. Ibid. They believed in the immortality of the soul. In all these things we see resemblances to the Atlanteans. The great Ethiopian or Cushite empire, which in the earliest ages prevailed, as Mr. Rawlinson says, from the Caucasus to the Indian Ocean, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the mouth of the Ganges, was the empire of Dionysus, the empire of Ad, the empire of Atlantis. El Idrisi called the language spoken to this day by the Arabs of Mahra, in eastern Arabia, the language of the people of Ad; and Dr. J.H. Carter, in the Bombay Journal of July 1847, says, "It is the softest and sweetest language I have ever heard." It would be interesting to compare this primitive tongue with the languages of Central America. The god Thoth of the Egyptians, who was the god of a foreign country and who invented letters, was called At Hothes. We turn now to another ancient race, the Indo European family, the Aryan race. In Sanskrit Adam means first. Among the Hindus the first man was Adima, his wife was Hiva. They dwelt upon an island said to be Ceylon. They left the island and reached the mainland, when, by a great convulsion of nature, their communication with the parent land was forever cut off. See Bible in India. Here we seem to have a recollection of the destruction of Atlantis. Mr. Bryant says, Ad and Ada signify the first. The Persians called the first man Adama. Adon was one of the names of the supreme god of the Phoenicians. From it was derived the name of the Greek god Adonis. The Arvad of Genesis was the Ar-Ad of the Cushites. It is now known as Ruad. It is a series of connected cities 12 miles in length along the coast, full of the most massive and gigantic ruins. Sir William Jones gives the tradition of the Persians as to the earliest ages. He says, Moshin assures us that in the opinion of the best informed Persians, the first monarch of Iran, and of the whole earth, was Mashab Ad; that he received from the Creator and promulgated among men a sacred book, in a heavenly language, to which the Mussulman author gives the Arabic title of Desatir, or Regulations. Mashab Ad was, in the opinion of the ancient Persians, the person left at the end of the last great cycle, and consequently the father of the present world. He and his wife, having survived the former cycle, were blessed with a numerous progeny. He planted gardens, invented ornaments, forged weapons, taught men to take the fleece from sheep and make clothing. He built cities, constructed palaces, fortified towns, and introduced arts and commerce. We have already seen that the primal gods of this people are identical with the gods of the Greek mythology, and were originally kings of Atlantis. But it seems that these ancient divinities are grouped together as the Aditya, and in this name Aditya we find a strong likeness to the Semitic Adites, and another reminiscence of Atlantis or Adlantis. In corroboration of this view we find: 1. The gods who are grouped together as the Aditya are the most ancient in the Hindu mythology. 2. They are all gods of light, or solar gods. Whitney's Oriental and Linguistic Studies, p. 39. 3. There are 12 of them. Ibid. 4. These 12 gods presided over 12 months in the year. 5. They are a dim recollection of a very remote past. Says Whitney, it seems as if here was an attempt on the part of the Indian religion to take a new development in a moral direction, which a change in the character and circumstances of the people has caused to fail in the mists, and fall back again into forgetfulness, while yet half finished and indistinct. Ibid. 6. These gods are called the sons of Aditi, just as in the Bible we have allusions to the sons of Ada, who were the first metallurgists and musicians. Aditi is not a goddess. She is addressed as a queen's daughter, she of fair children. 7. The Aditya are elevated above all imperfections. They do not sleep or wink. The Greeks represented their gods as equally wakeful and omniscient. Their character is all truth. They hate and punish guilt. We have seen the same traits ascribed by the Greeks to the Atlantean kings. 8. The sun is sometimes addressed as Aditya. 9. Among the Aditya is Varuna, the equivalent of Uranus, whose identification with Atlantis I have shown. In the Vedas, Varuna is the god of the ocean. 10. The Aditya represent an earlier and purer form of religion. While in hymns to the other deities long life, wealth, power are the objects commonly prayed for, of the Aditya is craved purity, forgiveness of sin, freedom from guilt, and repentance. Oriental and Linguistic Studies, p. 43. 11. The Aditya, like the Adites, are identified with the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. Yama is the god of the abode beyond the grave. In the Persian story he appears as Yima, and is made ruler of the golden age and founder of the paradise. Ibid, p. 45. See Zamna, p. 167 ante. In view of all these facts, one cannot doubt that the legends of the sons of Ad, the Adites, and the Aditya all refer to Atlantis. Mr. George Smith, in the Chaldean account of the creation, p. 78, deciphered from the Babylonian tablets, shows that there was an original race of men at the beginning of the Chaldean history, a dark race, the Zalmat Kwakwadi, who were called Admi or Adami. They were the race who had fallen, and were contradistinguished from the Saku or light race. The fall probably refers to their destruction by a deluge, in consequence of their moral degradation and the indignation of the gods. The name Adam is used in these legends, but as the name of a race, not of a man. Genesis chapter 5:2 distinctly says that God created man, male and female, and called their name Adam. That is to say, the people were the Adami, the people of Ad, or Atlantis. The author of the Book of Genesis, says M. Scobel, in speaking of the men who were swallowed up by the deluge, always describes them as Hadam, Adamite humanity. The race of Cain lived and multiplied far away from the land of Seth, in other words, far from the land destroyed by the deluge. Josephus, who gives us the primitive traditions of the Jews, tells us, chapter 2, page 42, that Cain travelled over many countries before he came to the land of Nod. The Bible does not tell us that the race of Cain perished in the deluge. Cain went out from the presence of Jehovah. He did not call on his name. The people that were destroyed were the sons of Jehovah. All this indicates that large colonies had been sent out by the motherland before it sunk in the sea. Across the ocean we find the people of Guatemala claiming their descent from a goddess called Atit, or grandmother, who lived for 400 years, and first taught the worship of the true God, which they afterward forgot. Bancroft's Native Races, Vol. 3, page 75. While the famous Mexican calendar stone shows that the sun was commonly called Tonatiuh, but when it was referred to as the god of the deluge, it was then called Atl-Tonatiuh, or At-Onatiuh. Valentini's Mexican calendar stone, article Maya Archaeology, page 15. We thus find the sons of Ad at the base of all the most ancient races of men, to wit, the Hebrews, the Arabians, the Chaldeans, the Hindus, the Persians, the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, the Mexicans, and the Central Americans. Testimony that all these races trace their beginning back to a dimly remembered Atlantis. End of chapter 1 of part 4. Part 1 of chapter 2 of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Part 4, The Mythologies of the Old World. A Recollection of Atlantis. Chapter 2, Part 1. The Kings of Atlantis become the gods of the Greeks. Lord Bacon said, "The mythology of the Greeks, which their oldest writers did not pretend to have invented, was no more than a light air, which had passed from a more ancient people into the flutes of the Greeks, which they modulated to such descents as best suited their fancies." This profoundly wise and great man, who has illuminated every subject which he has touched, guessed very close to the truth in this utterance. The Hon. W.E. Gladstone has had quite a debate of late with Mr. Cox as to whether the Greek mythology was underlaid by a nature worship, or a planetary or solar worship. Peru, worshipping the sun and moon and planets, probably represents very closely the simple and primitive religion of Atlantis, with its sacrifices of fruits and flowers. This passed directly to their colony in Egypt. We find the Egyptians in their early ages sun and planet worshippers. Ptah was the object of their highest adoration. He is the father of the god of the sun, the ruler of the region of light. Ra was the sun god. He was the supreme divinity at On, or Heliopolis, near Memphis. His symbol was the solar disk, supported by two rings. He created all that exists below the heavens. The Babylonian trinity was composed of Idea, Anu, and Bel. Bel represented the sun, and was the favorite god. Sin was the goddess of the moon. The Phoenicians were also sun worshippers. The sun was represented by Baal Samin, the great god, the god of light in the heavens, the creator and rejuvenator. The attributes of both Bel and Moloch, the good and bad powers of the sun, were united in the Phoenician god Melkart, king of the city, whom the inhabitants of Tyre considered their special patron. The Greeks called him Melicertes, and identified him with Hercules. By his great strength and power he turned evil into good, brought life out of destruction, pulled back the sun to the earth at the time of the solstices, lessened excessive heat and cold, and rectified the evil signs of the zodiac. In Phoenician legends he conquers the savage races of distant coasts, founds the ancient settlements on the Mediterranean, and plants the rocks in the Straits of Gibraltar. American Cyclopedia, article Mythology. The Egyptians worshipped the sun under the name of Ra. The Hindus worshipped the sun under the name of Rama, while the great festival of the sun of the Peruvians was called Ra Mi. Sun worship, as the ancient religions of Atlantis, underlies all the superstitions of the colonies of that country. The Samoyed woman says to the sun, "When thou, god, risest, I too rise from my bed." Every morning, even now, the Brahmins stand on one foot, with their hands held out before them and their faces turned to the east, adoring the sun. In Germany or France one may still see the peasant take off his hat to the rising sun. Anthropology, p. 361. The Romans, even in the later times, worshipped the sun at Emesa under the name Elagabalus, typified in the form of a black conical stone, which it was believed had fallen from heaven. The conical stone was the emblem of Bel. Did it have relation to the mounds and pyramids? Sun worship was the primitive religion of the red men of America. It was found among all the tribes. Dorman, Origin of Primitive Superstitions, p. 338. The Chichimecs called the sun their father. The Comanches have a similar belief. But compared with such ancient nations as the Egyptians and Babylonians, the Greeks were children. A priest of Sais says to Solon, "You Greeks are novices in knowledge of antiquity. You are ignorant of what passed either here or among yourselves in days of old. The history of 8,000 years is deposited in our sacred books, but I can ascend to a much higher antiquity, and tell you what our fathers have done for 9,000 years, I mean their institutions, their laws, and their most brilliant achievements." The Greeks, too young to have shared in the religion of Atlantis, but preserving some memory of that great country and its history, proceeded to convert its kings into gods, and to depict Atlantis itself as the heaven of the human race. Thus we find a great solar or nature worship in the elder nations, while Greece has nothing but an incongruous jumble of gods and goddesses, who are born and eat and drink and make love and ravish and steal and die, and who are worshipped as immortal in presence of the very monuments that testify to their death. These deities, to whom the affairs of the world were entrusted, were, it is believed, immortal, though not eternal in their existence. In Crete there was even a story of the death of Zeus, his tomb being pointed out. Murray's Mythology, p. 2. The history of Atlantis is the key of the Greek mythology. There can be no question that these gods of Greece were human beings. The tendency to attach divine attributes to great earthly rulers is one deeply implanted in human nature. The savages who killed Captain Cook firmly believed that he was immortal, that he was yet alive and would return to punish them. The highly civilized Romans made gods out of their dead emperors. Dr. Livingstone mentions that on one occasion, after talking to a bushman for some time about the deity, he found that the savage thought he was speaking of Sekomi, the principal chief of the district. We find the barbarians of the coast of the Mediterranean regarding the civilized people of Atlantis with awe and wonder. Their physical strength was extraordinary, the earth shaking sometimes under their tread. Whatever they did was done speedily. They moved through space almost without the loss of a moment of time. This probably alluded to the rapid motion of their sailing vessels. They were wise and communicated their wisdom to men. That is to say, they civilized the people they came in contact with. They had a strict sense of justice, and punished crime rigorously, and rewarded noble actions, though it is true they were less conspicuous for the latter. Murray's Mythology, p. 4. We should understand this to mean that where they colonized, they established a government of law, as contradistinguished from the anarchy of barbarism. There were tales of personal visits and adventures of the gods among men, taking part in battles and appearing in dreams. They were conceived to possess the form of human beings, and to be, like men, subject to love and pain, but always characterized by the highest qualities and grandest forms that could be imagined. Ibid. Another proof that the gods of the Greeks were but the deified kings of Atlantis is found in the fact that the gods were not looked upon as having created the world. They succeeded to the management of a world already in existence. The gods dwelt on Olympus. They lived together like human beings. They possessed palaces, storehouses, stables, horses, etc. They dwelt in a social state which was but a magnified reflection of the social system on earth. Quarrels, love passages, mutual assistance, and such instances as characterize human life were ascribed to them. Ibid, p. 10. Where was Olympus? It was in Atlantis. The ocean encircled the earth with a great stream, and was a region of wonders of all kinds. Ibid, p. 23. It was a great island, the then civilized world. The encircling ocean was spoken of in all the ancient legends. Okeanos lived there with his wife Tethys. These were the islands of the blessed, the garden of the gods, the sources of the nectar and ambrosia on which the gods lived. Murray's Mythology, p. 23. Nectar was probably a fermented intoxicating liquor, and ambrosia bread made from wheat. Soma was a kind of whiskey, and the Hindus deified it. The gods lived on nectar, and ambrosia simply meant that the inhabitants of these blessed islands were civilized, and possessed a liquor of some kind and a species of food superior to anything in use among the barbarous tribes with whom they came in contact. This blessed land answers to the description of Atlantis. It was an island full of wonders. It lay spread out in the ocean like a disk, with the mountains rising from it. Ibid. On the highest point of this mountain dwelt Zeus, the king, while the mansions of the other deities were arranged upon plateaus, or in ravines lower down the mountain. These deities, including Zeus, were 12 in number: Zeus or Jupiter, Hera or Juno, Poseidon or Neptune, Demeter or Ceres, Apollo, Artemis or Diana, Hephaestos or Vulcan, Pallas Athena or Minerva, Ares or Mars, Aphrodite or Venus, Hermes or Mercury, and Hestia or Vesta. These were doubtless the 12 gods from whom the Egyptians derived their kings. Where 2 names are given to a deity in the above list, the first name is that bestowed by the Greeks, the last that given by the Romans. It is not impossible that our division of the year into 12 parts is a reminiscence of the 12 gods of Atlantis. Diodorus Siculus tells us that among the Babylonians there were 12 gods of the heavens, each personified by one of the signs of the zodiac, and worshipped in a certain month of the year. The Hindus had 12 primal gods, the Aditya. Moses erected 12 pillars of Sinai. The Mandan Indians celebrated the flood with 12 typical characters, who danced around the ark. The Scandinavians believed in the 12 gods, the Aesir, who dwelt on Asgard, the Norse Olympus. Diligent investigation may yet reveal that the number of a modern jury, 12, is a survival of the ancient council of Asgard. According to the traditions of the Phoenicians, the gardens of the Hesperides were in the remote west. Murray's Manual of Mythology, p. 258. Atlas lived in these gardens. Ibid, p. 259. Atlas, we have seen, was king of Atlantis. The Elysian Fields, the Happy Islands, were commonly placed in the remote west. They were ruled over by Cronus. Ibid, p. 60. Tartarus, the region of Hades, the gloomy home of the dead, was also located under the mountains of an island in the midst of the ocean in the remote west. Ibid, p. 58. Atlas was described in Greek mythology as an enormous giant, who stood upon the western confines of the earth, and supported the heavens on his shoulders, in a region of the west where the sun continued to shine after he had set upon Greece. Ibid, p. 156. Greek tradition located the island in which Olympus was situated in the far west, in the ocean beyond Africa, on the western boundary of the known world, where the sun shone when it had ceased to shine on Greece, and where the mighty Atlas held up the heavens. And Plato tells us that the land where Poseidon and Atlas ruled was Atlantis. The garden of the Hesperides, another name for the dwelling place of the gods, was situated at the extreme limit of Africa. Atlas was said to have surrounded it on every side with high mountains. Smith's Sacred Annals, Patriarchal Age, p. 131. Here were found the golden apples. This is very much like the description which Plato gives of the great plain of Atlantis, covered with fruit of every kind, and surrounded by precipitous mountains descending to the sea. The Greek mythology, in speaking of the garden of the Hesperides, tells us that the outer edge of the garden was slightly raised, so that the water might not run in and overflow the land. Another reminiscence of the surrounding mountains of Atlantis, as described by Plato and as revealed by the deep sea soundings of modern times. Chronos or Saturn, Dionysus, Hyperion, Atlas, Hercules, were all connected with the great Saturnian continent. They were kings that ruled over countries on the western shores of the Mediterranean, Africa, and Spain. One account says, Hyperion, Atlas, and Saturn, or Chronos, were sons of Uranos, who reigned over a great kingdom composed of countries around the western part of the Mediterranean, with certain islands in the Atlantic. Hyperion succeeded his father, and was then killed by the Titans. The kingdom was then divided between Atlas and Saturn, Atlas taking the northern Africa, with the Atlantic islands, and Saturn the countries on the opposite shore of the Mediterranean to Italy and Sicily. Baldwin's Prehistoric Nations, p. 357. Plato says, speaking of the traditions of the Greeks, Dialogues, Laws, chapter 4, p. 713, there is a tradition of the happy life of mankind in the days when all things were spontaneous and abundant. In like manner God, in his love of mankind, placed over us the demons, who are a superior race, and they, with great care and pleasure to themselves, and no less to us, taking care of us and giving us place and reverence and order and justice never failing, made the tribes of men happy and peaceful. For Chronos knew that no human nature invested with supreme power is able to order human affairs and not overflow with insolence and wrong. In other words, this tradition refers to an ancient time when the forefathers of the Greeks were governed by Chronos of the Cronian Sea, the Atlantic, king of Atlantis, through civilized Atlantean governors, who by their wisdom preserved peace and created a golden age for all the populations under their control. They were the demons, that is, the knowing ones, the civilized. Plato puts into the mouth of Socrates these words (Dialogues, Cratylus, p. 397): "My notion would be that the sun, moon, and stars, earth and heaven, which are still the gods of many barbarians, were the only gods known to the aboriginal Hellenes. What shall follow the gods? Must not demons and heroes and men come next? Consider the real meaning of the word demons. You know Hesiod uses the word. He speaks of a golden race of men, who came first. He says of them, 'But now that fate has closed over this race, they are holy demons upon earth, beneficent averters of ills, guardians of mortal men.' He means by the golden men not men literally made out of gold, but good and noble men. He says we are of the age of iron. He called them demons because they were daimones, knowing or wise. This is made the more evident when we read that this region of the gods, of Chronos and Uranus and Zeus, passed through first a golden age, then a silver age, these constituting a great period of peace and happiness. Then it reached a bronze age, then an iron age, and finally perished by a great flood, sent upon these people by Zeus as a punishment for their sins." We read, "Men were rich then, in the silver age, as in the golden age of Chronos, and lived in plenty. But still they wanted the innocence and contentment which were the true sources of human happiness in the former age, and accordingly, while living in luxury and delicacy, they became overbearing in their manners to the highest degree, were never satisfied, and forgot the gods, to whom, in their confidence of prosperity and comfort, they denied the reverence they owed. Then followed the Bronze Age, a period of constant quarreling and deeds of violence. Instead of cultivated lands, and a life of peaceful occupations and orderly habits, there came a day when everywhere might was right, and men, big and powerful as they were, became physically worn out. Finally came the Iron Age, in which enfeebled mankind had to toil for bread with their hands, and, bent on gain, did their best to overreach each other. Dike, or Astrea, the goddess of justice and good faith, modesty and truth, turned her back on such scenes and retired to Olympus, while Zeus determined to destroy the human race by a great flood. The whole of Greece lay under water, and none but Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha were saved." Murray's Mythology, p. 44. It is remarkable that we find here the same succession of the Iron Age after the Bronze Age that has been revealed to scientific men by the patient examination of the relics of antiquity in Europe, and this identification of the land that was destroyed by a flood, the land of Chronos and Poseidon and Zeus, with the Bronze Age confirms the view expressed in Chapter 8, p. 237 ante, that the bronze implements and weapons of Europe were mainly imported from Atlantis. And here we find that the flood that destroyed this land of the gods was the flood of Deucalion, and the flood of Deucalion was the flood of the Bible, and this, as we have shown, was the last great deluge of all, according to the Egyptians, which destroyed Atlantis. The foregoing description of the golden age of Chronos, when men were rich and lived in plenty, reminds us of Plato's description of the happy age of Atlantis, when men despised everything but virtue, not caring for the present state of life, and thinking lightly of the possession of gold and other property. A time when, as the chants of the Delaware Indians stated it, p. 109 ante, all were willingly pleased, all were well happified. While the description given by Murray, in the above extract, of the degeneracy of mankind in the land of the gods, a period of constant quarreling and deeds of violence, when might was right, agrees with Plato's account of the Atlanteans, when they became aggressive, unable to bear their fortune, unseemly, base, filled with unrighteous avarice and power, and in a most wretched state. And here again I might quote from the chant of the Delaware Indians: "They became troubled, hating each other. Both were fighting, both were spoiling, both were never peaceful." And in all three instances the gods punished the depravity of mankind by a great deluge. Can all these precise coincidences be the result of accident? May we not even suppose that the very word Olympus is a transformation from Atlantis, in accordance with the laws that regulate the changes of letters of the same class into each other? Olympus was written by the Greeks Olympos. The letter A in Atlantis was sounded by the ancient world broad and full, like the A in our words all or altar. In these words it approximates very closely to the sound of O. It is not far to go to convert Atlantis into Atlantis, and this into Olympos. We may therefore suppose that when the Greeks said that their gods dwelt in Olympus, it was the same as if they said they dwelt in Atlantis. Nearly all the gods of Greece are connected with Atlantis. We have seen the 12 principal gods all dwelling on the mountain of Olympus, in the midst of an island in the ocean in the far west, which was subsequently destroyed by a deluge on account of the wickedness of its people. And when we turn to Plato's description of Atlantis, p. 13 ante, we find that Poseidon and Atlas dwelt upon a mountain in the midst of the island, and on this mountain were their magnificent temples and palaces, where they lived separated by great walls from their subjects. It may be urged that Mount Olympus could not have referred to any mountain in Atlantis, because the Greeks gave that name to a group of mountains partly in Macedonia and partly in Thessaly. But in Mysia, Lycia, Cyprus, and elsewhere there were mountains called Olympus, and on the plain of Olympia in Elis there was an eminence bearing the same designation. There is a natural tendency among uncivilized peoples to give a local habitation to every general tradition. Many of the oldest myths, says Baldwin, Prehistoric Nations, p. 376, relate to Spain, northwestern Africa, and other regions on the Atlantic, such as those concerning Hercules, the Cronidæ, the Hyborians, the Hesperides, and the Islands of the Blessed. Homer described the Atlantic region of Europe in his account of the wanderings of Ulysses. In the ages previous to the decline of Phoenician influence in Greece and around the Aegean Sea, the people of those regions must have had a much better knowledge of Western Europe than prevailed there during the Ionian or Hellenic period. The mythology of Greece is really a history of the kings of Atlantis. The Greek heaven was Atlantis. Hence the references to statues, swords, etc., that fell from heaven and were preserved in the temples of the different states along the shores of the Mediterranean from a vast antiquity, and which were regarded as the most precious possessions of the people. They were relics of the lost race received in the early ages. Thus we read of the brazen of bronze anvil that was preserved in one city, which fell from heaven. It was 9 days and 9 nights in falling. In other words, it took 9 days and nights of a sailing voyage to bring it from Atlantis. The modern theory that the gods of Greece never had any personal existence, but represented atmospheric and meteorological myths, the movements of clouds, planets, and the sun, is absurd. Rude nations repeat, they do not invent. To suppose a barbarous people creating their deities out of clouds and sunsets is to reverse nature. Men first worship stones, then other men, then spirits. Resemblances of names prove nothing. It is as if one would show that the name of the great Napoleon meant the lion of the desert, Napoleon, and should thence argue that Napoleon never existed, that he was a myth, that he represented power and solitude, or some such stuff. When we read that Jove whipped his wife and threw her son out of the window, the inference is that Jove was a man, and actually did something like the thing described. Certainly gods, sublimated spirits, aerial sprites, do not act after this fashion. And it would puzzle the myth-makers to prove that the sun, moon, or stars whipped their wives or flung recalcitrant young men out of windows. The history of Atlantis could be in part reconstructed out of the mythology of Greece. It is a history of kings, queens, and princes, of love-making, adulteries, rebellions, wars, murders, sea voyages, and colonizations, of palaces, temples, workshops, and forges, of sword-making, engraving, and metallurgy, of wine, barley, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, and agriculture generally. Who can doubt that it represents the history of a real people? Uranus was the first god, that is to say, the first king of the great race. As he was at the commencement of all things, his symbol was the sky. He probably represented the race previous even to the settlement of Atlantis. He was a son of Gaia, the earth. He seems to have been the parent of 3 races, the Titans, the Hecatoncheires, and the Cyclopes or Cyclops. I incline to the belief that these were civilized races, and that the peculiarities ascribed to the last 2 refer to the vessels in which they visited the shores of the barbarians. End of Part 1 of Chapter 2. 27. Part 2 of Chapter 2 of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Part 4. The Mythologies of the Old World, a Recollection of Atlantis. Chapter 2, Part 2. The Empire of Atlantis. The empire of the Titans was clearly the empire of Atlantis. The most judicious among our mythologists, says Dr. Rees, New British Cyclopedia, article Titans, such as Gerard Vossius, Marsham, Bocart, and Father Thomason, are of opinion that the partition of the world among the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, was the original of the tradition of the same partition among Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto, upon the breaking up of the great empire of the Titans. The learned Pezron contends that the division which was made of this vast empire came, in after times, to be taken for the partition of the whole world; that Asia remaining in the hands of Jupiter, Zeus, the most potent of the three brothers, made him looked upon as the god of Olympus; that the sea and islands which fell to Neptune occasioned their giving him the title of god of the sea; and that Spain, the extremity of the then known world, thought to be a very low country in respect of Asia, and famous for its excellent mines of gold and silver, failing to Pluto, occasioned him to be taken for the god of the infernal regions. We should suppose that Pluto possibly ruled over the transatlantic possessions of Atlantis and America, over those portions of the opposite continent, which Plato tells us were dominated by Atlas and his posterity, and which, being far beyond or below sunset, were the underworld of the ancients, while Atlantis, the Canaries, etc., constituted the island division, with Western Africa and Spain. Murray tells us (Mythology, p. 58) that Pluto's share of the kingdom was supposed to lie in the remote west. The underworld of the dead was simply the world below the western horizon. The home of the dead has to do with that far west region where the sun dies at night. Anthropology, p. 350. On the coast of Brittany, where Cape Raz stands out westward into the ocean, there is the Bay of Souls, the launching place where the departed spirits sail off across the sea. Ibid. In the like manner, Odysseus found the land of the dead in the ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules. There indeed was the land of the mighty dead, the grave of the drowned Atlanteans. However this be, continues Father Pezron, the empire of the Titans, according to the ancients, was very extensive. They possessed Phrygia, Thrace, a part of Greece, the island of Crete, and several other provinces to the inmost recesses of Spain. To these Sanchoniathon seems to join Syria, and Diodorus adds a part of Africa, and the kingdoms of Mauritania. The kingdoms of Mauritania embraced all that northwestern region of Africa nearest to Atlantis, in which are the Atlas Mountains, and in which, in the days of Herodotus, dwelt the Atlantes. Neptune, or Poseidon, says in answer to a message from Jupiter, "No vassal god, nor of his train am I. Three brothers, deities, from Saturn came, and ancient Rhea, earth's immortal dame. Assigned by lot our triple rule we know. Infernal Pluto sways the shades below. Over the wide clouds and over the starry plain, Ethereal Jove extends his high domain. My court beneath the hoary waves I keep, and hush the roaring of the sacred deep." Iliad, Book 18. Homer alludes to Poseidon as the god whose liquid arms are hurled around the globe, whose earthquakes rock the world. Mythology tells us that when the Titans were defeated by Saturn, they retreated into the interior of Spain. Jupiter followed them up, and beat them for the last time near Tartessus, and thus terminated a 10 years' war. Here we have a real battle on an actual battlefield. If we needed any further proof that the empire of the Titans was the empire of Atlantis, we would find it in the names of the Titans. Among these were Oceanus, Saturn or Cronos, and Atlas. They were all the sons of Uranus. Oceanus was at the base of the Greek mythology. Plato says (Dialogues, Timaeus, vol. 2, p. 533), "Oceanus and Tethys were the children of earth and heaven, and from these sprung Phorcys and Cronos and Rhea, and many more with them. And from Cronos and Rhea sprung Zeus and Hera, and all those whom we know as the brethren, and others who were their children. In other words, all their gods came out of the ocean. They were rulers over some ocean realm. Cronos was the son of Oceanus, and Cronos was an Atlantean god, and from him the Atlantic Ocean was called by the ancients the Cronian Sea. The elder Minos was called the son of the ocean. He first gave civilization to the Cretans. He engraved his laws on brass, precisely as Plato tells us the laws of Atlantis were engraved on pillars of brass. The wanderings of Ulysses, as detailed in the Odyssey of Homer, are strangely connected with the Atlantic Ocean. The islands of the Phoenicians were apparently in mid ocean. We dwell apart afar, within the unmeasured deep amid its waves. The most remote of men, no other race hath commerce with us. Odyssey, Book 6. The description of the Phaeacian walls, harbors, cities, palaces, ships, etc., seem like a recollection of Atlantis. The island of Calypso appears also to have been in the Atlantic Ocean, 20 days' sail from the Phaeacian Isles. And when Ulysses goes to the land of Pluto, the underworld, the home of the dead, he reached the far confines of Oceanus, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. It would be curious to inquire how far the poems of Homer are Atlantean in their relations and inspiration. Ulysses' wanderings were a prolonged struggle with Poseidon, the founder and god of Atlantis. The Hecatoncheires, or Cetimani, beings each with 100 hands, were 3 in number, Kotos, Gyges or Gyes, and Briareus, and represented the frightful crashing of waves in its resemblance to the convulsions of earthquakes. Murray's Mythology, p. 26. Are not these 100 arms the oars of the galleys, and the frightful crashing of the waves their movements in the water? The Cyclopes also were 3 in number, Brontes with his thunder, Steropes with his lightning, and Arges with his stream of light. They were represented as having only one eye, which was placed at the juncture between the nose and brow. It was, however, a large flashing eye, as became beings who were personifications of the storm cloud, with its flashes of destructive lightning and peals of thunder. We shall show hereafter that the invention of gunpowder dates back to the days of the Phoenicians, and may have been derived by them from Atlantis. It is not impossible that in this picture of the Cyclopes we see a tradition of sea-going ships, with a light burning at the prow, and arms with some explosive preparation, which, with a roar like thunder, and a flash like lightning, destroyed those against whom it was employed. It at least requires less strain upon our credulity to suppose these monsters were a barbarian's memory of great ships than to believe that human beings ever existed, with 100 arms, and with one eye in the middle of their forehead, and giving out thunder and lightning. The natives of the West India Islands regarded the ships of Columbus as living creatures, and that their sails were wings. Berosus tells us, speaking of the ancient days of Chaldea, in the first year there appeared from that part of the Erythraean Sea which borders Babylonia an animal endowed with reason, by name Oannes, whose whole body, according to the account of Apollodorus, was that of a fish; that under the fish's head he had another head, with feet also below, similar to those of a man, subjoined to the fish's tail. His voice, too, and language was articulate and human, and a representation of him is preserved even unto this day. This being was accustomed to pass the day among men, but took no food at that season, and he gave them an insight into letters and arts of all kinds. He taught them to construct cities, to found temples, to compile laws, and explain to them the principles of geometrical knowledge. He made them distinguish the seeds of the earth, and showed them how to collect the fruits. In short, he instructed them in everything which could tend to soften manners and humanize their laws. From that time nothing material has been added by way of improvement to his instructions. And when the sun set, this being, Oannes, retired again into the sea, and passed the night in the deep, for he was amphibious. After this there appeared other animals like Oannes. This is clearly the tradition preserved by a barbarous people of the great ships of a civilized nation, who colonized their coast and introduced the arts and sciences among them. And here we see the same tendency to represent the ship as a living thing, which converted the war vessels of the Atlanteans, the Cyclopes, into men with one blazing eye in the middle of the forehead. He married his sister Rhea, who bore him Pluto, Poseidon, Zeus, Hestia, Demeter, and Hera. He anticipated that his sons would dethrone him as he had dethroned his father Uranus, and he swallowed his first 5 children, and would have swallowed the 6th child, Zeus, but that his wife Rhea deceived him with a stone image of the child, and Zeus was conveyed to the island of Crete, and there concealed in a cave and raised to manhood. Subsequently Chronos yielded back to the light the children he had swallowed. This myth probably means that Chronos had his children raised in some secret place, where they could not be used by his enemies as the instruments of a rebellion against his throne, and the stone image of Zeus, palmed off upon him by Rhea, was probably some other child substituted for his own. His precautions seem to have been wise, for as soon as the children returned to the light they commenced a rebellion, and drove the old gentleman from his throne. A rebellion of the Titans followed. The struggle was a tremendous one, and seems to have been decided at last by the use of gunpowder, as I shall show farther on. We have seen Chronos identified with the Atlantic, called by the Romans the Cronian Sea. He was known to the Romans under the name of Saturn, and ruled over a great Saturnian continent in the Western Ocean. Saturn, or Chronos, came to Italy. He presented himself to the king Janus, and proceeded to instruct the subjects of the latter in agriculture, gardening, and many other arts then quite unknown to them, as, for example, how to tend and cultivate the vine. By such means he at length raised the people from a rude and comparatively barbarous condition to one of order and peaceful occupations, in consequence of which he was everywhere held in high esteem, and in course of time was selected by Janus to share with him the government of the country, which thereupon assumed the name of Saturnia, a land of seed and fruit. The period of Saturn's government was sung in later days by poets as a happy time, when sorrows were unknown, when innocence, freedom, and gladness reigned throughout the land in such a degree as to deserve the title of the Golden Age. Murray's Mythology, p. 32. All this accords with Plato's story. He tells us that the rule of the Atlanteans extended to Italy, and that they were a civilized, agricultural, and commercial people. The civilization of Rome was therefore an outgrowth directly from the civilization of Atlantis. The Roman Saturnalia was a remembrance of the Atlantean colonization. It was a period of joy and festivity. Master and slave met as equals. The distinctions of poverty and wealth were forgotten. No punishments for crime were inflicted. Servants and slaves went about dressed in the clothes of their masters, and children received presents from their parents or relatives. It was a time of jollity and mirth, a recollection of the Golden Age. We find a reminiscence of it in the Roman carnival. The third and last on the throne of the highest god was Zeus. We shall see him, a little farther on, by the aid of some mysterious engine overthrowing the rebels, the Titans, who rose against his power amid the flash of lightning and the roar of thunder. He was called the Thunderer, and the Mighty Thunderer. He was represented with thunderbolts in his hand and an eagle at his feet. During the time of Zeus, Atlantis seems to have reached its greatest height of power. He was recognized as the father of the whole world. He everywhere rewarded uprightness, truth, faithfulness, and kindness. He was merciful to the poor and punished the cruel. To illustrate his rule on earth the following story is told. Philemnon and Baucis, an aged couple of the poorer class, were living peacefully and full of piety towards the gods in their cottage in Phrygia, when Zeus, who often visited the earth disguised, to inquire into the behavior of men, paid a visit, in passing through Phrygia on such a journey, to these poor old people, and was received by them very kindly as a weary traveller, which he pretended to be. Bidding him welcome to the house, they set about preparing for their guest, who was accompanied by Hermes, as excellent a meal as they could afford, and for this purpose were about to kill the only goose they had left, when Zeus interfered, for he was touched by their kindliness and genuine piety, and that all the more because he had observed among the other inhabitants of the district nothing but cruelty of disposition and a habit of reproaching and despising the gods. To punish this conduct he determined to visit the country with a flood, but to save from it Philemon and Baucis, the good aged couple, and to reward them in a striking manner. To this end he revealed himself to them before opening the gates of the great flood, transformed their poor cottage on the hill into a splendid temple, installed the aged pair as his priest and priestess, and granted their prayer that they might both die together. When after many years death overtook them, they were changed into two trees that grew side by side in the neighborhood, an oak and a linden. Murray's Mythology, p. 38. Here we have another reference to the flood, and another identification with Atlantis. Zeus was a kind of Henry VIII., and took to himself a number of wives. By Demeter, Ceres, he had Persephone, Proserpine; by Leto, Apollo, and Artemis, Diana; by Dione, Aphrodite, Venus; by Semele, Dionysus, Bacchus; by Maia, Hermes, Mercury; by Alcmene, Hercules, etc., etc. We have thus the whole family of gods and goddesses traced back to Atlantis. Hera or Juno was the first and principal wife of Zeus. There were numerous conjugal rows between the royal pair, in which, say the poets, Juno was generally to blame. She was naturally jealous of the other wives of Zeus. Zeus on one occasion beat her, and threw her son Hephaestos out of Olympus. On another occasion he hung her out of Olympus with her arms tied and two great weights attached to her feet, a very brutal and ungentlemanly trick. But the Greeks transposed this into a beautiful symbol. The two weights, they say, represent the earth and sea, an illustration of how all the phenomena of the visible sky were supposed to hang dependent on the highest god of heaven. Ibid, p. 47. Juno probably regarded the transaction in an altogether different light, and she therefore united with Poseidon, the king's brother, and his daughter Athena, in a rebellion to put the old fellow in a strait jacket, and would have succeeded had not Thetis brought to his aid the sea giant Aegeon, probably a warship. She seems in the main, however, to have been a good wife, and was the type of all the womanly virtues. Poseidon, the first king of Atlantis, according to Plato, was, according to Greek mythology, a brother of Zeus and a son of Chronos. In the division of the kingdom he fell heir to the ocean and its islands, and to the navigable rivers. In other words, he was king of a maritime and commercial people. His symbol was the horse. He was the first to train and employ horses. That is to say, his people first domesticated the horse. This agrees with what Plato tells us of the importance attached to the horse in Atlantis, and of the baths and race courses provided for him. He was worshipped in the island of Tenos in the character of a physician, showing that he represented an advanced civilization. He was also master of an agricultural people. The ram with the golden fleece for which the Argonauts sailed was the offspring of Poseidon. He carried in his hand a three-pronged symbol, the trident, doubtless an emblem of the three continents that were embraced in the empire of Atlantis. He founded many colonies along the shores of the Mediterranean. He helped to build the walls of Troy, the tradition thus tracing the Trojan civilization to an Atlantean source. He settled Attica and founded Athens, named after his niece Athena, daughter of Zeus, who had no mother, but had sprung from the head of Zeus, which probably signified that her mother's name was not known. She was a foundling. Athena caused the first olive tree to grow on the Acropolis of Athens, parent of all the olive trees of Greece. Poseidon seems to have had settlements at Corinth, Aegina, Naxos, and Delphi. Temples were erected to his honor in nearly all the seaport towns of Greece. He sent a sea monster, to wit, a slip, to ravage part of the Trojan territory. In the Iliad, Poseidon appears as ruler of the sea, inhabiting a brilliant palace in its depths, traversing its surface in a chariot, or stirring the powerful billows until the earth shakes as they crash upon the shores. He is also associated with well-watered plains and valleys. Murray's Mythology, p. 51. The palace in the depths of the sea was the palace upon Olympus in Atlantis. The traversing of the sea referred to the movements of a mercantile race. The shaking of the earth was an association with earthquakes. The well-watered plains and valleys remind us of the great plain of Atlantis described by Plato. All the traditions of the coming of civilization into Europe point to Atlantis. For instance, Kelios, who lived at Eleusis, near Athens, hospitably received Demeter, the Greek Ceres, the daughter of Poseidon, when she landed, and in return she taught him the use of the plough, and presented his son with the seed of barley, and sent him out to teach mankind how to sow and utilize that grain. Dionysus, grandson of Poseidon, traveled through all the known world, even into the remotest parts of India, instructing the people as he proceeded how to tend the vine, and how to practice many other arts of peace, besides teaching them the value of just and honorable dealings. Murray's Mythology, p. 119. The Greeks celebrated great festivals in his honor down to the coming of Christianity. The nymphs of Grecian mythology were a kind of middle beings between the gods and men, communicating with both, loved and respected by both, living like gods on ambrosia. In extraordinary cases they were summoned, it was believed, to the councils of the Olympian gods, but they usually remained in their particular spheres, in secluded grottos and peaceful valleys, occupied in spinning, weaving, bathing, singing sweet songs, dancing, sporting, or accompanying deities who passed through their territories, hunting with Artemis, Diana, rushing about with Dionysus, Bacchus, making merry with Apollo or Hermes, Mercury, but always in a hostile attitude towards the wanton and excited satyrs. The nymphs were plainly the female inhabitants of Atlantis dwelling on the plains, while the aristocracy lived on the higher lands; and this is confirmed by the fact that part of them were called the Atlantids, offspring of Atlantis. The Hesperides were also daughters of Atlas. Their mother was Hesperis, a personification of the region of the West. Their home was an island in the ocean off the north or west coast of Africa. And here we find a tradition which not only points to Atlantis, but also shows some kinship to the legend in Genesis of the tree and the serpent. Titæa, a goddess of the earth, gave Zeus a tree bearing golden apples on it. This tree was put in the care of the Hesperides, but they could not resist the temptation to pluck and eat its fruit. Thereupon a serpent named Ladon was put to watch the tree. Hercules slew the serpent and gave the apples to the Hesperides. Hercules, we have seen, was a son of Zeus, king of Atlantis. One of his 12 labors, the 10th, was the carrying off of the cattle of Geryon. The meaning of Geryon is the red glow of the sunset. He dwelt on the island of Erythea in the remote west, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Hercules took a ship, and after encountering a storm, reached the island and placed himself on Mount Abas. Hercules killed Geryon, stole the cattle, put them on the ship, and landed them safely, driving them through Iberia, Gaul, and over the Alps down into Italy. Murray's Mythology, p. 257. This was simply the memory of a cattle raid made by an uncivilized race upon the civilized cattle raising people of Atlantis. It is not necessary to pursue the study of the gods of Greece any farther. They were simply barbarian recollections of the rulers of a great civilized people, who in the early days visited their shores and brought with them the arts of peace. Here, then, in conclusion, are the proofs of our proposition that the gods of Greece had been the kings of Atlantis. 1. They were not the makers, but the rulers of the world. 2. They were human in their attributes. They loved, sinned, and fought battles, the very sites of which are given. They founded cities and civilized the people of the shores of the Mediterranean. 3. They dwelt upon an island in the Atlantic, in the remote west, where the sun shines after it has ceased to shine on Greece. 4. Their land was destroyed in a deluge. 5. They were ruled over by Poseidon and Atlas. 6. Their empire extended to Egypt and Italy and the shores of Africa, precisely as stated by Plato. 7. They existed during the Bronze Age and at the beginning of the Iron Age. The entire Greek mythology is the recollection, by a degenerate race, of a vast, mighty, and highly civilized empire, which in a remote past covered large parts of Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. End of Chapter 2 of Part 4.